Welcome back to Sustainable AF, where we're taking you on a guided tour through the Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise known as the SDGs, a framework to try and help build a more sustainable future.
This series discusses the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in each episode, we will explore a particular goal, what it is, why it matters, and how we can address it.
Every week, we're going to be looking more closely at the systems that underpin the way we live and try to work out where we can identify actions that might change the world for the better.
I'm Alex. I used to be in banking, and now I'm in sustainable agriculture.
I'm Felicia, and I've been in this field for around 20 years. I've worked as a journalist, I've been an entrepreneur, and I've worked helping companies understand how they can face the risks of a climate-constrained future.
Beautiful. Today, we're talking about SDG 7. That's clean energy, which lies at the heart of the SDG framework, as it plays a key role in so many parts of what we're trying to achieve.
Lack of access to energy is one of the biggest constraints to economic and human development. Around the world today, nearly 1 billion people are still living without access to electricity. And of those who've got access, it's estimated that over 840 million of them live with unreliable and intermittent services. That's from grids that are essentially broken. What's really exciting as well about clean energy, and we'll get into this later, is what's amazing about it is the success we've had in transitioning from an old system to a new system, and the idea that we could potentially use that as a model for other industries.
So today, we are going to be trying to answer, what is clean energy all about?
We want to know, why does clean energy actually matter?
We want to look at energy systems.
And one of the things that's really important is this is not about knocking fossil fuels for its own sake. This is about learning by doing and taking advantage of all the things we know about innovation and knowledge and new science.
And finally, last but certainly not least, we're going to look at market shifts.
One of the things I think is really important is that many people think clean energy is about a battle between fossil fuels and renewable energy. What it's really about is providing access to electricity for the many millions who don't yet have it, helping them, support them in achieving an education, in building new jobs, and having access to health. In the developed world, it's more about the energy system and how that works, as well as its impact on the climate and on health.
Absolutely. And one thing we really need to understand when looking at clean energy and moving from one system, i.e. the fossil fuel system, to another, is how vital and important that energy is on all levels, all scales, from national power stations to run cities to cooking in someone's home. Energy lies at the absolute heart of this, and it's a big topic to tackle.
And this is one of the reasons it's so contested, because energy has really been the economic engine for the last few hundred years. It's how economies are built up. It's how citizens have been brought out of poverty. And it's now this established system. It works in a certain way. There's a lot of path dependency and a status quo where people think that this is the way they understand how to do things. But what we've seen in the last 10, 20 years is a complete transformation of the economics of clean energy. And that means we can actually change our electricity system. Now, that's actually quite straightforward, and I think we can do it. One of the big challenges is, what do we do about things like transportation and agriculture and heavy industry and heating, those areas where renewable electricity isn't necessarily going to cut it?
I think one thing that sticks out to me massively when engaging with the paradigm shift around clean energy is that we have fundamentally created industry around two fuels, coal and oil, and in the latter stages, gas, from these extractive elements. However, when looking to balance the grid and supply as many people as possible with clean energy, there's many different types of technology that need to be deployed. You've got wind, you've got solar, you've got hydro, you've got marine, you've got tidal. So Fee, I'm not sure if you can tell me of any others that I've not covered there, but there's a lot to unpack there between these different technologies. And as Fee just touched on, the cost of these technologies versus fossil fuels, extract oil versus create a solar park, the cost curves are very different, often leaning towards renewable energies for a cheaper solution.
Well, I think what's incredibly cool is solar power, for example. Solar PV, everyone talks about that a lot, but that's fallen in price by 90% in the last 10 years. Most of the world now, it's cheaper to build a renewable energy power plant than it is to build a fossil fossil fueled power plant. You try saying that, it's a bit of a tongue twister. The thing is that people's mindsets don't change as quickly as the reality of the world in which we live. The technologies have come down in price because we've rolled out so much of it, but there's economies of scale, there's learning by doing. We touched on that earlier. What's fascinating to me, and I want to pick up on a point you made, Alex, about extractive industries. We've kind of built the development of the 21st century, of where we are today, on the back of the exploitation of fossil fuels. But what if we could make it more of a regenerative approach? Because if you think about it, now, I think, Alex, you're the one who pointed out to me,
It was 1.2% of the Sahara Desert could produce enough solar power to power the entire world. It's absolutely
that's just phenomenal.
However, that does obviously come with its challenges of trying to ship all this energy across the world, across high voltage cables. Yes, there is the technology, but is that what clean energy should be about? Should we be about decentralizing power and having small power grids, a solar and a wind farm with a battery to power a village, a town, and scale it up? Or should we be looking at these mega projects where what's the one you were telling me about, Fee, when you connected solar in the Sahara and pumped hydro in the Nordics?
Oh, it's the supergrid project. There have been different versions of this that have been promoted for a number of years, and there are lots of challenges around crossing borders and international law and this, that, and the other. But the idea was that because there's so much pumped hydro storage in the Nordics, that if you connect the generation of PV in the Mediterranean to hydropower storage in the Nordics, you would actually have a system that works. Because the challenge that's always raised about renewable energy is that it's unreliable. That, solar only obviously works during the day. Wind tends to be stronger at night. There are differences, geothermals all the time, that can be baseload power, but really it's PV and wind that have caught the public imagination. But the criticism has been it's variable, it's difficult for the grid to manage. We need to have lots of nuclear or lots of coal or lots of gas to back it up. Well, we were told 20 years ago you'd never be able to get more than 20% renewables on the grid. So many countries have gone so far past that because they have interconnections outside countries, across borders. The thing that you mentioned about this distributed energy ideal, this idea of different areas of generation connecting in different ways, actually makes for a much more resilient system. You connect generation to storage, to demand management. You've got sensors that can turn down the draw on the grid. So, for example, if you've got, a massive building with 300 lifts in it, and there's a sudden spike in demand, maybe you can turn down the power draw on the lifts for a few seconds, maybe even a few milliseconds. So the lifts don't need all the power all the time.
So to clarify, the smart grid allocates energy where it's in demand rather than just having it floating in a grid for when it's needed.
Yes, exactly.
Clever.
There's this discussion all the time about baseload and the need for baseload. And my argument would be that a smart grid is interactive. It takes from where generation is happening towards where it's needed.
So I'm reading Bill Gates' new book, and he's talking about the need for renewables is huge, but because batteries are expensive, and we can talk about the cost of batteries and the cost curves there in a minute, but we have to have this base load. And obviously, Gates is a big fan of climate change, which is brilliant, but he's also a big fan of nuclear as a solution to climate change.
I'm going to stop you for a second. You said he was a big fan of climate change. I don't believe you.
He's a big fan of solving climate change.
Okay, cool.
And he is a real dude, don't get me wrong. But he definitely is nuclear centric. And I'm not sure, if you look at the cost of nuclear and the time it takes to build, whether it's even worth that, whether it's worth entertaining the idea.
Whether it might be a distraction.
Whether it might be, the opportunity cost of the investment into nuclear may be better placed in grid infrastructure, smart grids, and renewables that can relinquish the need for this baseload power that has been kind of on energy experts' mind, as we have to have a baseload in case there's certain surges. But if you can manage that power more efficiently, through smart grids, it kind of dispels the need for nuclear, which is an interesting idea.
I think it's really important because one of the discussions that has been going on regularly for as long as I can remember is the infighting amongst energy experts on whether we should go for renewables, whether we should go for nuclear, as if it's one or the other, which I don't think it is. I think there's a lot of technologies that need to be addressed. You mentioned the time it takes and the cost of building nuclear. I think this is a huge problem because action on climate change needs to happen now. We haven't got that long.
How long does it take to build a normal sized nuclear power station fee, roughly, like ballpark? And how much money?
Ballpark, I would say a decade, but the problem is that there's constant problems of getting agreements on investment because the risk profile changes. There's huge pushback from the public. Now, you can argue that, that's wrong and it needs to happen anyway, but you can't just do things without talking to people and persuading them it's the right approach to take. There's some fantastic technologies being developed in the nuclear industry around small and modular reactors. They're dealing with the problems of a potential meltdown by making them far less prone to that. They're dealing with the problem of nuclear waste by some technologies using spent plutonium rods. The point is they're being developed. They're on their way. I'm a big fan of the potential, but we're a good 10 years away from commercialization. What we need to do is act on stuff now.
So I see nuclear, admittedly it's an older technology, a bit like carbon capture and storage. Elon Musk has gone out there and said, I'll give $100 million for anyone that can solve carbon capture and storage. And, some of us would say, well, that's a tree, mate. But the high-tech version, I think from the fossil fuels industry's perspective, if you could stick an exhaust pipe on the end of your energy stations, your coal and gas and oil-fired power stations to suck the carbon out and bury it in the ground or whatever they propose doing with it, they would have done it before the renewables even got a hold. It comes into this debate that because renewables are so much cheaper than fossil fuels currently, the cost of fossil fuel energy, when you add CCS, this new technology, it's an added cost onto the unit of energy, it completely blows up their cost curves. So
yeah,
nuclear,
it has been
nuclear and CCS are these amazing ideas. They're great innovation. They've got they're really interesting. But then when you actually look into the economics or the timescales, you're like, this isn't commercial. That's why they're not fully commercial.
It's not economic. And the thing is, it's a really good point because these things have been around for a long time. And like I said, there's been these arguments that we don't need to take action on renewables because we're going to have nuclear, because we're going to have CCS. But it hasn't been commercial because there hasn't been a driver for the sector to do anything about it. It hasn't been able to make enough money to act fast enough to commercialize it fast enough. The energy penalty on a fossil fuel station of adding CCS is phenomenal. Where it is exciting, I know you want to interrupt me, but I just have to say this, it's really exciting, is the potential for use. So when you actually, instead of just capturing it on the end of a power station, you take that CO2 and you turn it into a product. Now that's an exciting opportunity and that changes the economics.
Absolutely. That's one way of getting around the unit cost of pure CCS, I suppose. And I would also like to add, I'm not against CCS. I'm more for tree planting because I think it's a nicer solution. But there's no silver bullet to this climate crisis. There's no silver bullet to the energy, the clean energy thing, as I said at the beginning. It will be many different roads, many different routes, many different innovations, many different technologies to solve this, because fundamentally as a globe, we've never tried to have to solve something this big before. So therefore, I'm behind every technology, but and we want to make you guys aware as many as we can, but and pick at the pitfalls, but also know that we probably still need it in the end.
There's also, I think there's something else that's really important to talk about when you're looking at clean energy, renewable energy, as one of the options in the big suite of technologies. But a lot of this is actually to do with the potential it has for changing people's lives in the poorer parts of the world. So I think the point to be made here is that renewable energy does more than just solve an energy problem.
And then when you dig into the data and you look, fossil fuel deaths attributed to 8.7 million globally in 2018. And it's our energy.
It's the air pollution caused by fossil fuels. It's 1 in 5 people you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. It's insane. And just from that perspective, forget climate change, just the healthcare perspective, the cost affiliated to that, from days lost working or medical bills, and the death toll is absolutely staggering. Just from that perspective, we should be looking at moving towards clean energy as fast as possible.
There was a thing from the World Bank that showed that actually the healthcare impacts of using smoky fuels like wood, kerosene, charcoal and dung, so, rural poverty fuels, $1.4 trillion a year. That's the cost of the economies where it takes place.
Unreal.
It's absolutely phenomenal.
So give me an example of what they're doing in rural off-grid areas to stop chopping down trees.
Okay, so something really simple. In Kenya, there's a company called Burn Manufacturing, which is designed and is producing an electric pressure cooker. So what that does, and it's actually testing that cooker in 8 different countries. Now, if you have distributed solar power in a rural village, so you can get solar panels out to a distance and they can start generating power. People can run mobile phones, they can run their electricity cookers, they can run a light. It can completely transform people's lives. If you cut down trees, there's a knock-on effect on everything. But if you haven't, what about the solar suitcase?
Yes, that's where I was going, Fee. The solar bloody suitcase. The solar.
It's one of my favourites. You want to do it, or shall I?
Solar suitcase. You do it. It's awesome. It's one of the best inventions I've heard in recent years.
So I don't know if you guys all know this, but according to the World Health Organization, it's about 800 women die in childbirth every day. And 99% of those deaths actually occur in developing countries. And did you know, and you probably don't, that one of the reasons for this is often that doctors or nurses or helpers, they can't see what's going on. Women often give birth at night. Solar Suitcase is this incredible project which literally sends out a suitcase with a PV panel in it and some medical lights and medical instruments and comms to, access remote help, a doctor perhaps if you can't or if there's a problem. What solar does is it solves this last mile problem about access to services. And we've talked about this with regard to poverty and healthcare and education. You have to have access to be part of society. And solar PV can actually do that on the ground.
Absolutely. From a child's perspective of being able to learn at night, that's a game changer. To be able to open your shop at night and trade, that's a game changer economically. Or, like you've just touched on, have medical treatments done at night because, funnily enough, you don't choose when you get ill or give birth or break your leg or anything like that. It's a complete game changer. And just something that the fossil fuel industry couldn't provide for developing countries because you need such a big grid.
I think the thing that's really important and something we probably don't talk about enough is that with each of the goals of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a whole bunch of sub-targets. And actually under SDG, under clean energy, a lot of the sub-targets are about providing modern energy services, digitization. It's about allowing the leapfrogging of an old style of doing things to an entirely new economic paradigm. And that's why renewable energy is such a huge part of the conversation.
So, Fee, let's talk about now what happened. We've talked about what happens when you don't have a grid and you can have pop-up solar, small scale, mini grids, that kind of thing. What about us in the developed world where we've got billions upon billions invested into the infrastructure projects for fossil fuels, our whole system set up on fossil fuels? What do we do? Where are the opportunities and where are the constraints?
Well, I think one of the things to be clear about is the opportunity is obviously there's an entirely new industry and many industries being developed. And that is a huge opportunity for economies, for investors and for workers, people who want to have jobs. But what we've got, because of the growth in renewable energy, is all the corollaries around that. We have to have storage. We need batteries. We need smart grid. We need demand management, and that's sensors and machine learning and AI. It's the management of balancing the grid. You know, we all talk a lot about electric vehicles. Well, there's no point in having electric vehicles unless the electricity is generated cleanly, because otherwise it's all carbon again.
Totally.
But if you do have renewably generated electricity, why not store that electricity in the car batteries when the cars aren't being used? I mean, there's a car that's...
Yeah, because how much does one actually use their car, and how much time is it being spent just sitting on the drive? If it's plugged into a power source, you know, I suppose you've almost built a mini grid there for cars and energy systems. If you
you could do. There's I think it's Renault, I can't remember which, but actually a lot of the car companies, they're working on these projects, developing virtual power plants. The idea that cars would go and park in a car park, and during the day, those cars parked in the car park would be plugged into the grid. And if the electricity is needed, it can be a virtual power plant. You can actually use it that way. And then when demand falls, you just power it back up again so it's ready for people to drive home. There's all these amazing new models that are being created. And I think it's really important that we think about, and I know I overuse the word, but the new paradigms, new ways of making things come together. So one of the problems we have with renewable electricity is that there are places where it can't make enough of a difference. Say you've got heavy industry, you've got cement, right, and you need carbon in the chemical process to make it. Well, that's a real problem for the carbon footprint. But how about if the carbon you used was recycled from emissions somewhere else? That could be a completely transformative approach.
Or, and we definitely need to dive into this subject because it is absolutely popping at the moment, and that is hydrogen and green hydrogen. Fee, can you?
And that's just where I was planning on going.
I thought it might be, but can you just run me through hydrogen, how it's created, and the difference with green hydrogen, and a little bit about the costs and why green hydrogen is probably the future, but normal hydrogen isn't ever really got off the ground?
Well, part of the real problem with hydrogen as a fuel is that most of it, almost all of it today, is generated from fossil fuels. So in exactly the same way as the problem with EVs, you need renewable generation to make it clean. So hydrogen is actually made from, so you basically power up something and you use an electrolyzer to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. So what happens is that gas, that hydrogen gas, is then stored and then can be burnt for fuel, or, you know, used in a number of different ways. Where it's really exciting for me is for storage. There are areas where, you know, you can talk about its use being pumped into certain processes to increase temperatures, because, for example, in steel making, you need really, really high temperatures, and renewable electricity can't always achieve that. But there's a lot of talk about the possibility of using hydrogen in passenger vehicles. And I'll be honest, I've always thought that was a weird idea. It's been popular in cycles, you know, every 5-10 years, someone goes, yes, let's have a hydrogen-powered passenger vehicle network. And all the fossil fuel companies will turn from petrol to hydrogen. And I just think it's unrealistic. I think if it was going to happen, it would have happened. I think there's too many different ways we can use things in interesting opportunities. The thing about hydrogen is the electrolyzers are incredibly expensive. They use noble metals. They're really expensive. And hydrogen has always been a lot. So if you talk about the fact that solar PV can generate power at a couple of cents, US cents per kilowatt hour, and yet I think lithium-ion batteries were over $1,000 per kilowatt hour 10 years ago, and hydrogen. Yeah, I mean, it's just a phenomenal differential in price. And hydrogen, the big goal is. Oh, sorry, yes, Alex.
EV battery. Lithium-ion batteries have gone from $1,200 per kilowatt hour in 2010 to $156 per kilowatt hour in 2020. So it's a complete transformation. It's like what we've seen in the cost of solar and wind.
And there's a real hope that path will be followed for hydrogen. It's a bit weird because the way you actually talk about hydrogen is the price per kilogram. So the big goal, the really exciting goal, is to bring it down to €1.5 per kilo by 2030. That would be transformational, but it's going to be a long process. The thing that's different today is so many people are throwing so much money at it that I think we are going to see a massive scaling up of the entire sector, which will bring prices down.
There is a lot of hype around green hydrogen at the moment, and I hope this could be a really nice complementary energy along with renewable energy. Am I right in saying? Am I right in saying green hydrogen is clean?
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes, because it's generated with renewable. I mean, again, clean is a really specific word, and I think I touch on this a lot, I know, but the terminology is so important. The definition of clean, the definition of green, is it renewable? There's talk about, from opponents about how solar's dreadful because it uses rare earth metals, and then what about recycling it, and isn't it dreadful? Well, yes, there's an element of that, but there's different elements to everything. It's about the overall life cycle.
Yeah, totally. When people say to me, "Oh, but what about solar panels? They pollute when you dump them in a landfill." Then, so one, if you actually look at it's a stupid debate, but if you look at the life cycle emissions of a fossil fuel versus solar, it's completely a non-plus conversation. And if you look at what we're trying to do with the cyclical economy and recycling end of life cycle solar panels, it completely wipes the table with the people that say, well, it's still polluting. Of course.
Yeah, I think there's one really important point we have to make here, though, and this is one that Alex is always pulling me up on, because I tend to get a little bit carried away sometimes. I think the point about this is we're not knocking fossil fuels because of what they did. They did bring a lot of people out of poverty. The whole growth of the economy is built on it. But what it is about the fact that we've learned more. We know more. We see the implications of the choices that we make. There's a brilliant story about a guy called Thomas Midgley, who was a scientist in the US in the late 19th, early 20th century. Now, not only was he one of the people responsible for putting lead into petrol or gasoline to stop the knocking noises in the engines, which ended up being a complete disaster for everybody who was ever affected by lead poisoning, but he also invented one of the hydrofluorocarbons. And he's like single-handedly responsible for some of the most damaging pollutants that have ever been used by the human race. But he didn't know any better. Well, he did actually know that lead was bad, and he promoted it anyway. But sometimes people will do anything for money. That's a different conversation.
Yeah, and we can move on to lobbyists in a second. And I think that you touched on a really important point there, Fee, that I always bark on about. We cannot look back to past and have a go at people for just trying their best and doing what they thought was great. And I think that's really important in this day and age where there's so much polarity, but to try and see the good in past, present, and future, be positive, look towards sustainable development pathways. And, we are carving out the world here. We decide what the future looks like. So therefore, do we want to take the bad road or the good road? And I suppose that comes down to an ethical question of everyone has a good road and a bad road. I'm going completely off the track here.
No, but I think there's a really interesting point, because what you're talking about is the problem that exists in a world where everyone feels like they're being judged if they make one decision or another. Yeah. And actually, there are really complicated problems. That what the academics talk about them as wicked problems because they're really sticky and they involve lots of different things and they're really, really difficult to solve.
I remember sorry, go on, Fee, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, no. It was just that we've got to stop having a go at each other and find a way of working together. We've got to get industries and government and different sectors and silos to work together instead of fighting all the time.
Yep, you nailed it. And you taught me all about this. Specialization, we're brought up to specialize in it. We are all brought up to specialize, whether you become a lawyer, a banker, a tree surgeon, a teacher. But it doesn't allow for the lateral thought that systems-based thinking needs, and to, for my opinion, to develop on a sustainable development pathway, we have to be able to look to the left, to the right, and incorporate a lot more than just what we're specialized in, because just specializing in something has led to us not being able to take a sum of the whole, and therefore, okay, we'll do this, it'll be really good, but oh, the ice caps are melting. Or we'll do this, oh, waterways are poisoned. We need to take a look at all different elements. And I know I've put 2 nods there to the environment, but that, it comes up in social problems as well. And if we're to make the world a better place, we need to fundamentally readdress how some systems are put together. And to do
and I love the fact that you mentioned that, because one of the things that's really important, and we're going to talk about this a lot more in the next pod, which is about decent work and economic growth, but actually about the way we understand the world is changing, and we have to open up across those different groups. There's, capitalism has effectively been the dominating way in which we function for the last 100 years or so, maybe longer. But is it really exactly the right way to deal with things? Because it hasn't dealt with externalities. And what we're seeing at the moment is a massive market shift.
Absolutely. And I think that is really nicely exemplified by, if you ask any economist, pretty much, how do you measure growth? It's by GDP. But it doesn't take into account any of these other factors that are just sort of touched on. The happiness index is something that we will touch on much more in our next podcast, but it's a really different way to measure the...
For those of you who don't know, the happiness index is actually how Bhutan decided it was going to measure its performance as a country.
Go Bhutan. But rolling back here, away from happiness index and back towards capitalism, economics, let's take a look at the greening of the economy, the carbon bubble, and where investment is going towards ESG and around that.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really good points in there. One of which is ESG, which is environmental and social governance, which is a framework a lot of the investment community is now using in order to try to understand the implications of corporate decision making. But what's really exciting is the concept of the carbon bubble and of stranded assets. And this is this coming together of a number of different trends. So part of this is the increasing economic competitiveness of renewables, but a lot of it is driven by investor concern about the risks around climate change and what that means for fossil fuel assets. Central banks are concerned that the impact of climate change could destabilize economies. So they're looking at ways of trying to build up more resilient investments. So the carbon bubble is quite a simple idea. It's that basically fossil fuel companies are valued on their reserves, most of which are in the ground. And we have a limited carbon budget of what we can actually emit if we're going to achieve the Paris Agreement targets. Well, if they can't sell what's in the ground, there's the potential that there's a bubble in their valuation. In the same way, stranded assets are about the fact that if circumstances change and you cannot make back your investment, that asset is stranded.
Yeah, totally. And I think when you look at the concept of the carbon bubble and the way that policy and taxation are angling towards, I'm talking about a price on carbon here, it only makes these investments less attractive from a policy perspective and an investment perspective. So I think another scary fact is I think 30% of all pension portfolios globally are fossil fuel affiliated stocks and bonds. If there is a mass correction in price, that leaves a lot of people exposed, and I think that's why you were talking about the European Central Bank is really worried about a carbon bubble. Mark Carney.
Oh yeah, that was more the general central bank group. If anyone's interested, look up the Network for Greening the Financial System, because that is absolutely fascinating. The thing is, I think what people have begun to understand is there are two kinds of risks that we face. One of which is the risk of climate change. So is there going to be a flood where the plant is? But the big one is transition risk, and that's policy risk. What if there is a big increase in the price of carbon? What if locally a country says, right, renewable energy plants get first access to the grid. So you've got a coal-fired power plant, but you can't sell your energy. If you can't make the money back, you're not going to invest in it. It's one of the things that has slowed so much investment in nuclear, in coal. The global position on coal investment is fundamentally different than it was even 2 years ago. HSBC has just had a shareholder resolution to stop funding coal-fired power plants.
So I'll ask you this, Fee. Do you think in 2021 we are in a position that we could completely, if policymakers and politicians went, right, that's it, pull your socks up, we're going to completely decarbonise immediately, do you think renewable energies could power the world in its current state? Do we need 10 years? What, I know I've just thrown you a curveball there.
We certainly couldn't do it. We couldn't do it this year. No, I mean, it's there's not enough of it. This is about scaling up. It's about doing things faster. It's about doing things smarter. What we need to do is make the right decisions now to set a framework so that we can actually invest in the right way, stop putting money into the wrong things, build things together, actually, build out education, build out innovation, build out knowledge sharing. Climate literacy is so important. You've got people making decisions about the future of their businesses, the future of their families, the future of their careers, and they don't even understand that there's really a problem or what it is or what the implications are. There's people who just sort of go, Greta gets upset and goes on strike. It's not about that. It's about fundamental changes to the way in which the world works.
And I suppose from that point, you can either see it as a negative, oh, stuff's changing, or you can see the positives like we're trying to, and the opportunities from an investment, social, natural pathway to make things better. And I suppose that comes down to the sort of person you are. If you're listening to this podcast, we hope you're the latter, you're like us, but maybe not. And hopefully we're changing your mind a little bit. But
actually, even if we're not changing your minds, we want to have a conversation about it, because this is the thing. It's not about telling people what to do. It's about having the debate. It's about asking the questions. There's lots of practical problems. They need to be resolved. And there's political problems and there's economic problems. There's going to be geopolitical impacts of renewable energy becoming more prevalent. It's absolutely unquestionable that this is a really hard thing to solve. So I think it's a really challenging one. So I think it's important, but only if we're specific.
So we're in the middle of an energy transition, which is fundamentally shifting the way our economy works. At the same time, the transition within the energy system has shown what can be achieved when we commit the right way. It just needs scaling up and developing more.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're going to do in the next few episodes is just explore how that transition could be achieved in other areas. So anyway, we hope that you've enjoyed our short introduction to the world of clean energy. We know it's complicated, but we're really interested in any questions you have and really happy to answer any of them. This is a huge topic, and as you might be able to tell, we spend a lot of time arguing about what to include. But we'll put more stuff on the website, so don't forget to check it out and ask us questions. And if you enjoyed the pod, then please like us and rate us.
So guys, that's it from us. We hope you'll join us next week when we continue our journey to becoming sustainable AF.